Hello, everybody, and welcome back. It has been a while. Before I go any further, I'm just going to wait to make sure I can hear myself on YouTube. If anybody has any problems, just let me know in the chat with the audio coming through or anything, but it seems to be good on my end. So I think we're good to go, which means I can get rid of this because it's just me tonight flying solo, so I don't need to be able to hear anything else going on. So welcome back, everybody. It's so nice to be back. It's been quite a while since I've done anything because I actually just finished a 4-week summer class, teaching a 4-week summer class. That's always really intense. And then I also had a bad cold for 2.5 of those weeks. You could still hear a little bit of that cold, but I'm past it. I just sound, there's just a little residual in the voice. But we're back, and we're going to do something a little bit different tonight from what I normally do. Tonight is just straight down the middle evolutionary biology. It's very topical. We're talking about the Delta variant of SARS coronavirus 2. This is just a great example of how evolutionary theory is useful in the real world, right? We hear, sometimes you talk about academic topics, and it's like, okay, that's great, but like, how does this apply to the real world? Well, we're going to see how some fairly well understood evolutionary dynamics explain what's going on right now with the coronavirus pandemic. Now, one more note I want to make before we get started is that as I speak right now, it is August 6th, 2021. The stuff that I'm going to be talking about is what we know right now on August 6th, 2021. Next week, next month, next year, what I'm saying tonight may not be valid anymore. So we're going with the best of what we know right now in terms of things like I'll talk about the Delta variant in a little bit. So when I talk about what we know about that, I'm speaking right now. And, 6 months from now, we may have different data, and it may turn out that what we thought we knew right now was actually somewhat wrong. So just keep that in mind, that if you're watching this in early August of 2021, you're probably pretty good. If you're watching this in 2022, we may have learned some stuff that maybe some of the stuff I say about the Delta variant isn't quite right compared to what we thought we knew when I did this initially. So just keep that in mind, that, knowledge is a moving target, and I'm speaking with what knowledge I have right now, which in the future we may learn new things. So just keep that in mind as we go. So that being said, let's get into it tonight. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the evolution of virulence. And there's going to be some terms here that we have to define and some basic concepts that we have to get out of the way before we actually get into what's going on with SARS coronavirus 2. So bear with me. We're going to split this into 2 parts. We're going to talk about the evolution of virulence, and then we're going to bring it around to the pandemic. So I promise this is going to get around to coronavirus very soon, within a few minutes. So we'll start with virulence. What in the world is virulence? Virulence, if we're being fancy about it, we could say it's pathogen-mediated morbidity and mortality. What does that mean in English? Basically, if you have an organism, a virus, bacteria, fungus, whatever, and that thing gets inside you or on you in some way, and it causes disease symptoms, then that thing has virulence. It has the capacity to make you sick or potentially kill you. That's what morbidity and mortality means. Morbidity is sick, mortality is death, right? So if another entity can cause illness or death, it has virulence. Now, the stuff that we're going to be talking about here applies to viruses, bacteria, fungal pathogens, eukaryotic pathogens like malaria, tapeworms, right? But we're going to be framing this in the context of viruses, because we're eventually going to loop around and talk about SARS coronavirus 2. So keep that in mind. I'm going to be talking about viruses mostly, but this applies to other stuff, these broad concepts. Okay, now one more important note about virulence here, just off the top, is that it is not an inherent property of a pathogen. It is due to the interaction between the host and the pathogen. So like this right here, this thing, some of you may recognize that is Ebola virus. It's this kind of filamentous, twisty thing. That's Ebola virus. Ebola virus has very high virulence, but the virus itself, it's just out and about, it's sitting on a desk or whatever, that virus is not going to hurt anybody, right? The virulence is due to the way it interacts with your own tissues, with your own cells, with your own body, right? It's the interaction and the resulting harm to you from that interaction that is the virulence. So just keep that in mind, that virulence, it's about the interaction. It's not an inherent property of the thing in question. Okay, so why does virulence evolve? Now, there's a whole lot of hypotheses about virulence evolution. We're not going to go into all the different ideas that we now know are incorrect. We're just going to go through kind of what we know right now, again, August 2021. The questions we want to address are, as a pathogen, why be virulent? What's the benefit to causing an illness and potentially death in your host? And even, is there a benefit, right? Or is it just, incidental? So there's a bunch of reasons for virulence. It could just be a side effect of infection. It could be just completely incidental. So think, for example, about a tapeworm, right? Tapeworm lives in your intestines. It causes a little injury when it embeds in your intestines. It got the structure with little hooks that embed, but that's not going to really hurt you. That'll heal. It's not a big deal. The problem from a tapeworm is completely incidental to what it does. It doesn't directly destroy your tissue. It doesn't break down any of your cells. But what it does is it eats your food, right? So it's stealing calories from you. So over time, that could cause a problem, right? So that's completely kind of incidental. You can also have within host competition. Basically, you're a virus, lots of other viruses around, you're competing for cells to infect. Well, you got to get really good at infecting those cells. The better you are, the more damage you're going to do. So you could have within host competition driving virulence. And then finally, you could have virulence that actually facilitates transmission from host to host. An example of this would be cholera, right? Cholera causes really severe diarrhea. Cholera also spreads through contaminated water. So the symptoms, diarrhea, actually directly facilitate the transmission of that bacteria from host to host, right? So virulence can actually facilitate transmission. What we're going to focus on today is within host competition, because it's these dynamics, the competition that goes on both within and, as we'll see, between different hosts, that's going to drive the evolution of virulence within a population of pathogens. Okay, so let's talk about intra-host competition, which is the fancy way of saying competition within a host. Basically, a pathogen, a virus gets into a host, right? It has to compete with the other pathogens that are already infecting that host that would use the same cells as their host cells, right? So the flu or a cold virus or coronavirus, right? These things infect your nose, your lungs, right? So they're all competing for the same real estate. You're also, as a virus in that situation, competing with the host, because the host isn't just going to sit down and take it. The host is going to fight back. We have immune systems, right? So you're also competing with the host. You're in a race with the host to infect those cells before the host can kill you or inactivate you. And you're also kind of in an arms race with the host to evade the countermeasures that are being thrown at you. So that's intra-host competition. You have all these different levels of fighting within the host for the limited resources you need in order to propagate. This leads to selection for better infectivity, faster, more efficient binding to your host cells, making more viruses before you burst out of your host cell, whatever the case is, right? You're just going to get better at infecting your host cells. This means you're going to cause more harm to your host compared to a less competitive variant. And this is going to lead to higher virulence, right? It's just a direct, you're doing more damage to your host in less time. So you're going to make your host sicker, right? So in general, and we're speaking tonight in, general rules, general themes, right? There's always, in biology, there's exceptions to everything, but we're speaking in general themes. In general, intra-host competition to be a better competitor within a single host leads to higher virulence, right? It leads to characteristics of that virus that make the host sicker. Okay, but there's a but, because there's always a but. There's always something else going on here. There are trade-offs. And the relevant concept when we're talking about intra-host competition, the relevant concept that makes us go, wait a minute, is inter-host competition. This is competition with pathogens in other hosts to be the first ones to infect a subsequent host, right? So if I've got a virus and you've got a virus, then someone over there has never been infected by this virus. The viruses in me and the viruses in you are racing with each other. They're competing with each other to get into that other host first. So effective inter-host competition, competition between hosts, requires efficient transmission. You have to be good at getting from one host to another in order to be an effective competitor in the inter-host arena. Now, this leads to an interesting question. Can you be too virulent? And of course, the answer is yes, right? Just think about this thematic, just kind of conceptually, right? If you are so good at competing for cells within your current host, you just, you're bull in a china shop. You're in, you burst out, you get to a new one, you burst out, you destroy a bunch of cells real fast. What happens if you kill your host before you actually encounter another potential host? What happens if you make your host so sick they never leave their house or they end up in the hospital? They don't encounter any other potential hosts. Are you going to spread efficiently through that population? Are you going to have effective inter-host competition? No, it's possible to be too virulent. An example of this you could think of is Ebola. There is a hypothesis with Ebola. This is not universally accepted, but it's out there. It's this idea that Ebola could never be, in its current state as we know it, could never be the basis for a widespread pandemic because it is simply too virulent. It burns out too fast. You may have heard that phrase with regard to pandemics, that they burn out if they're too severe. The idea with that is that Ebola makes infected people so sick that it limits their opportunity to actually spread that virus to additional people, right? So you can have a situation where you have such high competitiveness within a single host, leading to very high virulence, that it collapses your ability to compete between hosts and you don't transmit, right? So there is a potential trade-off here. Now, the conventional wisdom on this question works like this. If you're more virulent, you have less chance for transmission. And a way to think about this is the flu, right? You get the flu's terrible. Your whole body hurts, you have a fever, you don't want to eat, right? You're just exhausted all the time. So you just stay in bed and everything hurts for a week, right? You don't have that many opportunities to infect other people in that situation. Now, on the other hand, you get a common cold. Okay, you got the sniffles, you're sneezing, maybe you're coughing. It's not pleasant, but you could be out and about. You could tough it out for the day, so go to work, right? You're interacting with people, you're touching doorknobs. By the way, I'm talking about this in a pre-pandemic context. Obviously, with the coronavirus pandemic, the math is a little bit different, right? But just pre-pandemic context, this is kind of the conventional wisdom. Now, I want to be very clear about this dynamic because you can see, in situations like this, the flu versus the cold, how there's obviously a trade-off between transmission and virulence, right? The flu is more virulent, but the cold has higher transmissibility. Now, I want to be very clear that this is just a general trend. It does apply in some cases, potentially a lot of cases, but not all cases. There are exceptions to this rule. We're not going to go into them tonight, but there are some well-documented exceptions to this where higher virulence is actually more transmissible. We're not going to worry about it tonight, so don't worry about it, but just know this is a general trend. It is not a universal rule. Keep that in mind. What I want you to take away from this is not this trade-off directly. What I want you to take away from this is this inter-host competition versus intra-host competition and the tension between those two levels of competition, okay? So let's talk about what's actually going on here. If you have selection within one host, right, you tend towards higher virulence. If the main selective pressure driving the evolution of a virus is within a single host, then you're going to tend towards being more virulent. You're going to be a better competitor in that host. You're going to do more damage in that host. You're going to make that host sicker. If the main selective pressure driving the evolution of that pathogen is selection between hosts, selection to get efficiently from one host to another, that's going to tend towards lower virulence. Again, general rule, not in every case, but in general, we see that that will tend towards lower virulence. Now we can kind of illustrate this. This is a figure from a book called Why We Get Sick, which I will conditionally recommend. There's some stuff in there I thought was kind of but there's other parts that I thought were really informative and well done. So this figure I think is really useful. So we have two panels here showing where we have intra-host selection predominating in panel A and inter-host selection predominating in panel B. In panel A, for both of them across the x-axis is just time, and then it's just quantity or amount on the y-axis, but it's totally arbitrary units for the y-axis. So when you're just competing within one host, you see your productivity of the pathogen is going to just increase and increase and increase. It's a positive feedback loop, right? Because it's an arms race among all the viruses in that host to get better and better and better. So as a new variant appears that's better at competing, you're now imposing a stronger selective pressure on everybody else to get even better, right? So you're just selecting for more and more infectivity. That's going to lead to more and more damage to the host, potentially ultimately killing that host. If you're in a situation where the dominant, the most important type of selection acting on your pathogen population is getting from host to host, killing your host is a really bad strategy, because how are you going to spread once you kill your host? In general, you're not. As with all things in biology, there are exceptions. We're not going to go into them tonight, but there are exceptions. But this is the general rule. If the hard thing to do, where there's the most selection, the strictest competition is to get to the next host, instead what you tend to see is you reach a plateau of pathogen productivity where you're not going to kill your host. You're going to tend to kind of level off, and your host will get sick, but it won't get worse and worse and worse. You don't have a positive feedback loop operating for higher and higher degrees of infectivity, right? This is actually has experimental support behind it, this kind of paradigm of inter versus intra-host competition. So in this experiment, don't worry about the figure yet. I'll walk you through the figure in just a second. But in this experiment, what they did is they took a bacteriophage called T7, and they allowed it to infect a host population at very high density and a host population at very low density. And they recorded the parameters, like the growth rate of this virus at these different densities of host. And here are the data for what they found. So on this figure, the y-axis is time. You could just think of this as time making new viruses. There's a lot in this paper about like the different parts of a viral life cycle. Not relevant. What you need to know here is this is just time making new viruses. And then here we have fitness, just basically just growth rate of the virus, right? How fast is it replicating? In the high density hosts, we see a very fast rate of replication, and they're only replicating within their host for like 5 minutes before they kill that host. That's like the maximum, right? And the average is much lower than that, right? Now, the total time within the host is like 20 or 30 or 40. Like, I forget the total time because doing other stuff before it starts replicating. But the important thing is it's replicating for a short amount of time. And in that time, it makes a lot of viruses, and then it bursts out, kills that host, moves on to the next cell. That's where you have a lot of hosts. So when you have phage and a lot of hosts, replicate and burst very rapidly. When you have low density hosts, right, phages with very few hosts available, the optimal strategy that is favored by selection is to get into that host. It's to stay in that host for a fairly long period of time, more than twice as long, making new viruses that whole time and taking more than twice as long to kill that host cell. The point there is if you burst that host too fast, you might not encounter another host. So you want to maximize your ability to make new viruses in your current host before risking moving on to something new, right? So this is the exact same dynamic that we've already talked about. What's going on in the high density hosts is that getting from host to host is easy. So the type of selection that's predominating here is intra-host competition. So you have to be fast, which means you're very high virulence. In low density hosts, the type of competition that's driving this is inter-host competition. The hard thing to do is find another host. So we're getting inter-host competition, which is competition that limits virulence to maximize the likelihood of successfully transmitting to a new host. So we have this paradigm of intra versus inter-host competition, and we have experimental support for how these dynamics work. So the big picture is that we have selection for and against virulence. You could have selection to make your host sick. You could have selection to not make your host as sick. Here are kind of some of the trade-offs, right? Effective competition within your host versus harm or kill your host before you can reproduce or before reproducing enough to readily spread to another host. And you have to, facilitate transmission, but what if you harm your host and reduce the opportunities for transmission because your host is sick in bed instead of out and about in the world? Or you kill your host before you even transmit? Not a good strategy. So there's going to be this push and pull that's going to be dependent upon the ecological conditions. How many hosts are around? How susceptible are those hosts? Right. So now let's take these general evolutionary concepts and let's apply them to the current situations. Let's talk about the pandemic, right? So we're talking here about SARS coronavirus 2, right? That's severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, because there was the original SARS coronavirus back in 2003. This is an RNA virus, so it's got an RNA genome. It is enveloped, meaning it has a phospholipid membrane around the capsid. There's spike proteins embedded in that membrane, those famous spike proteins that we've all heard of. Here they are. There are some spike proteins sticking out of that envelope. Now, there are now, as of 2019, 7 human coronaviruses. 4 of them cause common cold. They just circulate, and you just get them once every 2 to 3 years. Some of them you can get them every year. Some of them you get it, and then you're resistant for like 3 years. It's, they just circulate around. They cause a cold. No big deal. There are 2 other coronaviruses that are scary. There's the original SARS coronavirus from 2003, and then there's the MERS coronavirus, that's Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which I think it's dumb to name viruses after locations like that because they pop up and then it still has the same name, but it's not in the same location. I don't think that's a good naming convention, but whatever. So then you get your MERS coronavirus from 2012. I think that outbreak ended like 2014, right? So it was the original SARS was 0304, and then MERS was 2012 to I think 2014. On top of that, so that's 6, right? You've got 4 regular ones and then 2 zoonotic, very dangerous ones. And then adding on top of that, you've got this one, SARS coronavirus 2, which is also zoonotic. It's likely from bats. We're not going to get into that tonight. And then the disease that results from this coronavirus is called COVID-19. That's coronavirus disease 19 for 2019 when it first appeared. This will probably be renamed to SARS-2 eventually, would be my thinking, because we have the original SARS coronavirus, and then SARS coronavirus 2, the original disease, SARS, the new disease, SARS-2. I would think that. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's my guess. Okay, so that's the kind of the virus we're dealing with here. And specifically right now, again, August 6th, 2021, we're dealing with the Delta variant is just like the thing that is either already exploded or about to explode basically everywhere else, everywhere in the world. Now, some really interesting things about the Delta variant. What we know is that it seems to have a much higher viral load within infected people, up to 1,000 times higher. Now, there's been some very recent research, like just published this week, that's saying maybe that's an overestimate. Maybe it's not 1,000 times higher, but the most common number that's floating around is 1,000 times higher viral load. So fine, maybe that's the case. What we do know with Delta is that it is more transmissible. I'll go into more detail with that in just a few minutes. The interesting thing here is that we have mixed data on mortality. By some measures, I'll first say that we don't have any really good large sample size studies on this question yet. I'm sure we will within a few days or a week after I sit here talking about this, and I can remove the question marks one way or another. But as I speak right now, we don't have super great data on this. But we have what we know is that it's not 10 times deadlier than the earlier variants. It's not even twice as deadly as the earlier variants. Is it maybe 5 times worse? Maybe. Is it maybe 5 times less? Or is it maybe 5% worse? Maybe. Is it maybe 5% less virulent? Maybe. We don't really know. It's close enough that it's approximately the same. As far as we can tell, it's close to the same right now. Now that's interesting, and I want to just put a pin in something. It's interesting because if you have 1,000 times the viral load, but it's approximately the same level of virulence, then that means like those viruses, each individual virus on average are doing a lot less damage, right? So just think about that and just put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that idea in a few minutes. Now, really interesting thing about the Delta variant is it seems to outcompete all the other variants, including some new variants that have since popped up. In the few cases where you've got Delta plus one of the newer ones, Delta still wins in that competition. These are figures from a website called covariance.org. Keep track of the variants across different countries and what fraction of the documented cases are each variant. So this is for the UK, US, Germany, and Denmark. I just took a screenshot of like the first 4 that pop up when you go onto the website this afternoon. And green here is Delta. So this is from June of last year to June of this year right here. So there's July and then into August. And Delta is just selective sweep, right? It just takes over the population, and the vast majority of cases are the Delta variant. So the Delta variant is extremely competitive, is what we know. So the thing we want to talk about is why, and that's what we're going to end this with. We're getting close. We're almost done here, everybody, already. So we're gonna answer why is the Delta variant better at competing in the current environment than the earlier strains, or the earlier variants, I should say. Now, to answer that question, we first have to dive into this concept of transmissibility a little bit. And I'm going to give some background, some terms that I'm sure people have heard over the course of the last year and a half, because we're all learning all these terms now, but I'm just going to give the details just so we're all on the same page, right? So transmissibility is just your ability to get from one host to another, right? How well do you do that? And we can quantify that. So you have this thing called R0, right? This is your basic reproductive number. This is the baseline average new infections from a single infection. Okay, so one person that's infected, everybody's susceptible. What's the kind of the baseline rate of infection here? Now, I want to be clear about this. R0 is a phenotype. So R0, the transmissibility of a pathogen, is going to respond to selection, right? This is something that's going to respond to selective pressures. So what we know, and again, I'm speaking from August 6, 2021, this may change, but the original SARS coronavirus 2, your R0 is like 2 to 4, which makes it more transmissible than your average seasonal flu. Your Delta R0 is estimated to be in the 6 to 8 range, which is, that is really going to spread really fast. Now, CDC is putting it at the higher end of that range, closer to 8. I've read some of the stuff and some of the data that they're using to get to that number. I think that's a little bit of an overestimate. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's a little bit of an overestimate. I think it's likely that it's closer to 6. So I'm going to say 6 to 8 is the range. We don't know exactly where it is. Who knows? Tomorrow we can learn that it's 10 or that it's 4. But speaking tonight, we're going to say 6 to 8. The big takeaway is that Delta is more transmissible than the original variant, variants plural. Now, the other relevant kind of thing here is the effective transmission rate, or R sub E, or just R sometimes. I'm just going to call it R to keep it easy. This is the average number of new infections from a single infection in the present context. So whereas R0 is a phenotype, and that'll evolve over time, R is a product of the conditions in the pandemic right now. So as a pandemic progresses, as people get infected and either die or recover, as people get vaccinated, then that R is going to change. And we've all probably seen the graphs. Oh, R is 1.5. Oh, now it's only 0.8, right? It changes over the course of the pandemic based on what's going on in the here and now. So just the goal, right, as we're trying to control this pandemic, is to get R below 1 so that it goes extinct, right? That's the concept of herd immunity, right? And we'll get to there kind of on the back end. Okay, so now that we've established these different parameters, let's explain why. Let's explain the Delta variant. Think about early in a pandemic, right? New virus pops into humans, never infected humans before. The entire population is susceptible. It's really easy to get from person to person because literally everybody is susceptible to this virus, right? This means the rate limiting step, the step that is hard as the virus, right? I'm going to personify the virus, right? If you're competing, right? The step that is hard, the step where you are likely to lose in your competition, is reproducing within the current host. If there is a variant within the current host with you that infects faster than you, that is where you might lose. This means that we are imposing intra-host competition on these viruses, and it's intra-host selection that is going to predominate, that is going to drive the evolution of these viruses, which means we would expect them to be selected for greater infectivity, which means probably higher virulence, and potentially lower R naught, right? A lower intrinsic level of transmissibility, because it doesn't matter. Your R naught could be 2, it could be 4, it could be 8, like you're gonna find a new host. So the thing you need to focus on early in the pandemic is being able to compete in your present host. But what happens later in a pandemic? Like right now, most of the population, even in places like the United States that have a huge anti-vax population, and I will say right now, while we're on the topic, since I mentioned it, any anti-vax propaganda or COVID hoax propaganda or any of that stuff is a bannable offense on this channel. So like if you're dropping that in the chat, you will be banned for that. So just heads up, everybody. So later in a pandemic where most of the population is either vaccinated or recovered from a past infection, it's really hard to get from one host to another because like most people in the population are no longer susceptible. So the rate limiting step, the step where you're likely to lose in your competition, is the viruses in one host losing out to the viruses in another host to get to the few remaining susceptible people in that population. So getting to that new host is the hard part, which means we're imposing inter-host competition. It's that competition between hosts, that is going to drive the selection operating on this virus, which means we're selecting for higher transmissibility. We're selecting for a higher R naught. And given what we've talked about already tonight, that means we're potentially selecting for lower virulence, right? For all those reasons we talked about earlier. So in other words, what we're seeing is we're driving down the transmission rate. We're driving down R via vaccination, right? That imposes selection for higher R naught, for higher intrinsic transmissibility, because the virus won't survive if the actual rate of transmission falls below 1. If on average, every infected person is not transmitting to at least one additional person, if on average it's 0.9 or 0.8 or 0.5 or 0.1, eventually that virus is going to go extinct within that population, right? And that state, when the virus can't propagate because there aren't enough susceptible hosts, that's called herd immunity. Vaccination imposes selection for higher transmission because what you're doing is you're imposing a selective pressure by driving the population towards herd immunity. This has downstream effects for how the virus evolves, and this is what we're seeing in Delta, right? That higher R naught that we see in Delta, right, may be associated with lower virulence. Think about this for the Delta variant, right? It spreads much more readily from person to person, but it had, even despite that higher viral load that we talked about, maybe 1,000 times higher, maybe not quite that much, but maybe 1,000 times the viral load, but not actually more deadly as far as we know right now. Per capita, on the viral terms, that's actually doing a lot less damage to the host, right? So we have much higher viral load, not higher virulence on net, means maybe we're driving this thing to a lower virulent state by imposing inter-host competition, right? That potentially explains what's going on with the Delta variant. And we actually have a lot of details on how Delta works. So let's be specific here. The Delta variant tends to concentrate in the nose rather than the lungs. Well, why is that? Think about this. Higher viral load, right? More viruses closer to the exit to the body, right, makes for greater transmissibility, higher R naught. But it's also going to do less damage compared to being concentrated in the lungs like the earlier variants. right? So you can see how this trade-off works just in practical terms, right? The inter-host competition is selecting for variants of SARS coronavirus 2 that are in your nose rather than your lungs. Well, something that hangs out in your nose is a lot less likely to cause a severe illness than something that hangs out in your lungs, despite the higher levels of virus that are present. And we can go one step further here and talk about breakthrough cases with vaccination and Delta. Why is Delta leading to potentially more breakthrough cases, that is to say, infections in vaccinated people? Well, the vaccines work because they flood your system with protective antibodies. All of us that are vaccinated have tons of antibodies in our blood right now. And anytime the virus gets in there, those antibodies are like, aha, they get them. Now, that's going to be most effective in parts of your body that have lots of blood flow, lots of capillary beds, right? Well, your nose isn't a part of your body like that. So it's possible, even if you're vaccinated, for Delta to get into your nose and get a foothold. And then you get a cold, basically, while your immune system fights it out in your nose. But anytime any of those viruses try to move down into your lungs, well, your lungs have lots of blood flow, right? So those viruses move down into your lungs and they're immediately mobbed by all those protective antibodies. And even though you could get a positive infection, you could have an actual infection in a person who's vaccinated, the likelihood of it making them very sick is very low because once it gets into the lungs, the antibodies are able to smack that down immediately. So a ton of what we're seeing here in the Delta variant is actually explainable with these well understood dynamics. So to wrap this up, the Delta variant has the characteristics of a virus under selection to maximize transmissibility. It is likely that this is the direct result of widespread vaccination, right? We are driving this virus to have to be better at getting from host to host. And in doing so, we may be making it less deadly in the process, which means there are two outcomes for how this ends. One, vaccinations keep going. We hit herd immunity. Boom. I'm really hopeful this is going to happen once kids down to 5 and eventually down to 6 months and get vaccinated. That's going to be millions and millions of more people that can get vaccinated. I'm speaking about the United States here. Your mileage may vary in different country. If SARS can't keep its R above 1, that means we hit herd immunity and it's going to go extinct. But even if that doesn't happen, maybe it does keep its transmissibility above 1. It's able to hang out. That's probably going to require some trade-offs in terms of how much harm it causes its hosts. Because as the fraction of susceptible hosts continues to go down, you have to get really good at getting from host to host. And if you make your host sick, and if you kill your host, you're not going to be as good at that as a respiratory virus. If you're hanging out in the lungs, you're not going to be as good at that. If you're hanging out in the nose, you're going to be better at transmission, but you're also going to be less likely to kill your host. So what is a potential outcome here? I'm going to make a prediction. Predictions are hard, especially about the future, but I'm going to make a prediction here. We'll see how this holds up. But one of the potential outcomes, and I don't think it's super unlikely, is that SARS coronavirus 2 basically becomes the 5th circulating coronavirus that causes a common cold. That is one potential outcome here as we drive it to have to get better and better at transmission through widespread vaccination. We're going to drive it to the point where if it's severely virulent at all, it's not going to efficiently transmit, right? So that's what these dynamics look like. And I think that's one of the places this may be headed. We'll see how that holds up in a year or two, right? But the better outcome would just be everyone gets vaccinated, we hit herd immunity, goes extinct, right? That's the better outcome. So that is it for tonight. That is how evolution, like well understood evolutionary dynamics, explain the nuts and bolts of what's going on with the Delta variant right now as of August 6, 2021 with the coronavirus pandemic. So the very last thing I will leave you with, everybody, is get vaccinated. If you are not vaccinated, get vaccinated. It is the best way, and it's the only way we're going to end this pandemic. If you have friends, if you have family who are not vaccinated, encourage them to get vaccinated. Show how other people in your peer group are vaccinated, because like statistics don't convince anyone who's on the fence right now. The thing that's going to convince them is peer group stuff. Really, like literally peer pressure is what's going to convince people. So please work with people in your immediate circles to get vaccinated. So thank you all for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed this chat, this foray into the evolutionary biology of viruses and pandemics, hit that like button down there. What are we sitting at right now? We've got 31 people watching and 21 likes. Come on, people, hit that like button. If for some reason you are watching this and you are not already subbed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button. As I talk right now this evening, I'm like this close to 2,000 subscribers, which is a pitifully small number, but like it'd be a big deal for me. So it would be really cool to get over that hump. So if you're not already subscribed and you're watching this, please subscribe. Also, I normally don't say this because this channel caters to a very, very specific audience, right? This is a kind of a niche thing that I do here. But this particular video is a little more broad. It's a little applicable to things, kind of in the real world. So share this one around, share it with people that you think might find it interesting, and just share the general evolutionary knowledge of what's going on here with the coronavirus pandemic. And the very last thing is just some programming notes. Like I said, I just finished a class and got over a bad cold. So I'm doing this to kind of hit that sweet spot in there because just in a day or two, I'm going on vacation for a week, so I won't be doing anything then. But then I have some stuff that I'm planning for when I come back that I think will be fun. And that's it, everybody. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate you all joining me for this. I hope it was both informative and enjoyable. I will see you all next time. Have a great night.